You're listening to Intractable, a podcast about life amidst the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm your host, Skyler Inman, and today we're delivering the second part of a 2-episode series on identity. Before we get started, I wanted to ask you, our loyal listeners, for a favor. We have loved reading your reviews on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd just like to remind you that one easy way you can help spread the word about Intractable is by rating and reviewing us, wherever you listen to our episodes. So if you find the show thoughtful, informative, and captivating, like user PSH63 did, let us know. Not only are we happy to get the feedback, but you'll be doing your part to expand the Intractable community. Last time, in episode 2, we discussed the complex question of Israeliness, what has defined it, expanded it, and limited it over time. This week we're doing the same with Palestinian identity. Inside, you'll hear stories of loss, resilience, hope, and despair, of death and birth and creativity. This is Crossing the Green Line, Part 2, Palestinian. If you listened to our last episode, you probably remember Yvonne. Could you list all of the different ways that you've ever described your identity?
Oh, God. How long do we have?
As long as you need.
As long as I need.
She's our musical advisor at Intractable, and I spoke with her about the complexities of living in Israel as a non-Jewish citizen, a member of the 20% of the country who fall into the state's Arab-Israeli minority. And if you listened to episode 2, then you probably remember that I said I'd let Yvonne tie the two sides of this series together. In this episode, Yvonne will act as our springboard. We've got a lot to talk about. A weighty history marked by loss, dispossession, war, violence, extremism, and the struggle to define oneself and one's future in a political landscape that is so totally dominated by the conflict. But we'll start with something that ties together many of the stories you'll hear today, and that's
music.
Yvonne's story picks up several years ago, right after she had finished high school and was beginning her studies at the Interdisciplinary Center, a private college in Herzliya, Israel.
I felt very lonely because I was the only Arab here at the IDC. I was kind of like, in a weird way, wanting to be more connected to my culture. It was weird for some reason all of a sudden to be in this space where my identity, my heritage was not being recognized. And so I really felt like I wanted to represent.
Yvonne signed up to take a course in radio broadcasting. And during this class, it dawned on her that maybe if she took a 1-hour slot each week at the IDC's radio station, she could carve out a little room on campus for Arabic music, and in doing so, a little room in her own mind for her identity.
I decided to do this music show. I figured, okay, I like music. I'll just start looking for stuff. And I had one lead. I had one artist that I really, really enjoyed. And I kind of started digging deeper and deeper, and I found this whole network of indie, alternative Arabic music that was also hip-hop, rock, it was punk, it was alternate, it was everything that you can think of, all the genres you can think of, speaking in a language that was my own and that I could recognize and relate to.
Yvonne's show, The Bridge, has been running pretty consistently ever since she began the series years ago. Starting out as a relative newcomer to the scene, she has become an encyclopedia of knowledge when it comes to the who's who of Palestinian music.
You have bands like Dam, who are like the forefathers of Palestine. Amer Zahr, who is just really, really... Maysa Doe, who's also in the group. And she has... Ghazal is a really interesting group as well. They're very... Toot aren't specifically Palestinian, but... they do touch upon those issues. Khalas, the Arabic Rock Orchestra, El Container, Apo and the Apostles, Zenobia, who do more of electronic, Rim Banna, who passed away recently, Ministry of Debki, 47 Soul, can go on and on. There's just so many.
The show has acted for Yvonne as a way of making peace with herself. At times, the music is a way for her to make room in her head for the identity she still sometimes feels she can't fully explain.
I don't belong to one specific side, and that was never the point for me, ever. I never wanted to be 100% American, 100% Palestinian, or 100% Israeli.
In other moments, like when she's reminded of the fact that it's still quite common in Israeli society to deny that Palestinian identity truly exists, or that painful historical events like the Nakba really occurred, Yvonne turns to the music for its ability to comfort, to chronicle the pain she knows is real, for its ability to tell true stories and to communicate emotions that many Palestinians share.
When the Nakba comes around every year, you get a lot of people saying, oh, there's no such thing, never happened. But then you listen to the music, you meet people who were there, who experienced that. And when you listen to these songs, they're not coming from these empty stories or fake. They're people. These are people who have experienced these things, and thank God that there are these artists, because they put that into words and they get the story out, and whoever wants to hear will hear it.
But in addition to talking about the difficult parts of history, or about anger towards the Israeli military presence in the West Bank, despair over the blockade of Gaza, Palestinian music also has another major theme: the frustration of constantly feeling obligated to talk politics.
Music can be political, but only if we make it political. Because if we see an Arab artist and he's singing, we automatically assume it's about the conflict and it's about something or another. Being constantly politicized is something that every Arab has to deal with on a daily basis. And I think it's become sort of defense mechanism for ourselves in order to be able to kind of get our point across. And even in humor, a lot of comedians will take that front as well.
For those of you who don't know, when us Palestinians come to Tel Aviv airport, they have like a VIP room for us. They let us stay there as long as we want.
This is Palestinian-American comedian Amer Zahr doing stand-up in Ramallah. We'll get back to him later, but I just wanted to drop a couple of his jokes in here since Yvonne mentioned it.
No, none of my Palestinian friends ever go on vacation, and people ask me that too. They go, why don't Palestinians go on vacation? And I tell them it's easy, it's simple. We don't like to leave our house for more than 2 or 3 days. We know what happened last time we did that shit.
And it's difficult.
This is something that came up in almost every interview we conducted for episode 3. The overwhelming presence of the conflict, of occupation, of politics, and of tension when it comes to the Palestinian identity. As if, just by nature of the past century, any non-political aspect of Palestinian heritage and culture has been wiped, quite literally, off the map.
If you ask a civilian who's just trying to get by on a day-to-day basis, they just want to keep their mouth shut and not get into those situations.
This song, I'm Not Political, is from the film Junction 48, a movie about a young Arab-Israeli rapper named Kareem, played by Tamer Nafar from Dam, the group Yvonne mentioned earlier as the forefathers of Palestinian rap. In the film, Kareem is trying to make a name for himself in the music scene, and his songs talk about all sorts of relatable political realities for the Arab population of Lod, a mixed Arab-Jewish city in Israel. He writes songs about growing up poor, about the local drug trade, an industry a few of his childhood friends have been pulled into, as well as songs about run-ins with the police and so on. But in I'm Not Political, Kareem, or perhaps more accurately Tamer Nafar, who plays him and who wrote the lyrics to the song, attempts to wrestle with his desire to just exist. Not politically, not in the context of conflict or occupation or whatever you want to call it, but to just live. It's impossible, the lyrics suggest, to be apolitical when you're seen as a demographic threat, a dangerous other, an unwanted population. Every act becomes an act of resistance against those who want you gone. And the main act of resistance is art. What comes next is a difficult story. One I've been trying to figure out how to tell for months now. It's a story of mothers and sons, or more specifically, of two mothers and two sons. It's the story of a happy place in one of the toughest neighborhoods in the West Bank. And it's also the story of a bloody uprising that killed thousands of people on both sides, of a period of time that put the worst of humanity on display for all the world to see. But it's also the story of the aftermath of this, of rebuilding. It's the story of a theater. In the 1980s, a Jewish Israeli woman moved to the city of Jenin, a town in the northern part of the West Bank that is situated adjacent to a refugee camp of the same name. The city was, and still is, a proudly Palestinian town, and the woman, named Arna, stuck out in more ways than one. Arna had been born in the 1920s in the British Mandate to Jewish parents. She had joined the Palmach, an early Israeli military organization, and had fought in the 1948 war. The war, if you remember, that established the State of Israel, and the war that sent waves of Palestinians, like those who arrived to the Jenin refugee camp, into exile. Following a period of disillusionment with some of the things she had seen during her military service, Arna had joined the Communist Party, and through the party she met and fell in love with a Palestinian Christian man, with whom she had 3 sons. By the time she moved to Jenin, Arna was in her 60s. She had decided to dedicate herself to creating an educational program for the children of the West Bank, something to allow the children of Jenin and its refugee camp to have a creative outlet. Art as a form of therapy and creative expression as a form of nonviolent resistance. The only problem was, the people of Jenin didn't really know what to make of this Israeli woman. The only Israelis they regularly had contact with in Jenin were Israeli soldiers, and so they were suspicious, to say the least.
But then, little by little, she started to gain trust.
That's the voice of Nabil El-Rai, the creative director of the Freedom Theater of Jenin. It's the group that took up Arna's legacy decades later, and we'll return to him in a bit. For now, he'll help tell the story of Arna's early projects in Jenin.
And the first woman from the camp stepped in and said, "You're welcome to work in my house." So she took her in and she started to work inside of the house. This turned to be a great movement, an amazing movement, especially by women.
That woman was Samira Zubaydi, and thanks to her hospitality, Arna made use of the top floor of Samira's house for rehearsals. In fact, 2 of Samira's own sons, Zakaria and Daoud, participated in the plays. This was the late 80s and early 90s. If you recall from our last episode, it was a period of great hope for many Israelis, and so Arna was able to recruit dozens of Israeli volunteers who came to Jenin and to Samira's house each week to help facilitate the theater's events. One of these Israelis was Arna's son, Giuliano, a handsome, successful actor who worked in Israel. Giuliano was half Palestinian and half Israeli, able to switch with ease between Arabic and Hebrew, although Giuliano preferred to call himself 100% Israeli and 100% Palestinian, as he did in this interview. You're half Jewish, isn't that right, Giuliano? I think I'm 100% Jewish, 100% Palestinian, and 100% from here, he says. And from the videos that remain of these years of the theater, it seems like Giuliano was really talented at getting awkward adolescent kids to loosen up and engage in the sometimes embarrassing business of acting. When I say that Arna wanted to engage the children in art and performance as therapy, I really mean it. In this scene from Giuliano's documentary about his mother's work, Arna talks to the children after a difficult night in Jenin. The houses of 2 boys in the room had been demolished the previous day by the Israeli army. It's not mentioned in the movie why it happened, but it's usually a method used by the military to destroy weapons factories or punish the family members of those involved in planning attacks on Israeli civilians. In the scene from Giuliano's film, though, all you see is a couple of sad, stunned kids. Why are you angry? Arna asks one boy named Ashraf. My house has been destroyed, he replies. By whom? Arna presses. By the army. Which army? The Israeli army, he says. And what would you like to do to them? To kill them, he responds. Okay, Arna says. Get up. I'm the army. What do? Come on. Ashraf looks at her with an embarrassed smile, as if, now that he has to act it out, he realizes the foolishness of his answer. He stands up and steps over the other kids in the crowd. He changes his answer. I'd curse them, he says. So go on, Arna says. Curse me. Before long, Ashraf and the other kids in the room, including Ala, who is the other boy whose house has been destroyed, have become hysterical at the silly scene of Ashraf struggling with Arna. Next, Arna hands out crinkly tissue paper, and the kids stand and yell and tear at the paper. All right, she says, this is anger, and when we're angry, we have to express it. You react like this because your anger is deep. And this is when Giuliano's voice cuts in.
In 8 years' time, Ala will become the leader of Al-Aqsa Brigade in Jenin.
You may not know what the Al-Aqsa Brigades are. I certainly didn't before I started this project. But for Israelis who were alive at the time, the name definitely rings an alarm. The Al-Aqsa Brigades, named after the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest religious site in the world for Muslims, are a militant group that emerged in 2000, at the same time as the bloody Second Intifada. They were one of a handful of groups that executed suicide bombings and shootings on Israeli civilians, often teaming up with groups like Hamas, the militant organization that to this day controls the Gaza Strip. The Al-Aqsa Brigades were a group that followed Hamas's tactics of direct, bloody attacks on civilians. Attacks designed to inflict as much violence, pain, and bloodshed on as many people as possible. These took shape as shootings in malls, suicide bombs in buses, backpacks packed with shrapnel and ball bearings in order to create maximum casualties. These were the news stories in the 2000s. This was the face, and sometimes the only face, Israelis saw of the other side of the conflict in this period.
In a crowded Jerusalem restaurant. A lunch-hour massacre carried out by a Palestinian suicide bomber.
Jaffa Street in central Jerusalem blew himself up. Right now we're dealing with close to 31 wounded. We have a number in various stages of serious to moderate.
We'll return to the role of these types of attacks in episode 5, when we discuss extremism, terrorism, and violence, and the role in the conflict. For now, I'd like to return to Giuliano's movie, and to the theater kids who came of age in this terrible period. I've watched the movie more than once, and the moments of joy and freedom you see on the kids' faces as they act and play in the theater are placed in sharp contrast with the path that each child takes years later. Some children grow into adults who become members of the Al-Aqsa Brigades. Some take up arms locally within Jenin during the Israeli army's brutal siege of the city. Others get married and have kids and just try to survive it all. But throughout the Intifada, even those kids are losing childhood friends left and right. I'm still not sure what to make of it, all of this, and I don't think Giuliano knew what to think of it either. The footage in the film is a sharp before and after. 2 snapshots in time of a group of kids and of the mess that was made of their generation during this terrible period. Here, on the one hand, was Giuliano, the Israeli and Palestinian son of Arna. the woman who was so widely beloved in Jenin, the mother of an arts movement that tried to give a hurting community some outlet for their frustration. And then there were children like Zakaria, the son of Samira, the woman who welcomed Arna and her theater project into her home. Samira, who during an Israeli army raid in Jenin in 2002, was shot in the head by a sniper. Zakaria, her son, who becomes one of the leaders of the Al-Aqsa Brigades, and thus one of the most wanted men in the West Bank. Stories like this remind me of the fact that the conflict is not a straight line. It comes in peaks and valleys, hot periods followed by cool ones, times when the only thing gaining steam is more and more violence, followed by times when something as gentle and as hopeful as a youth theater project can take root. The Second Intifada was obviously one of those hot, violent periods.
It was really ugly, the scene at the time.
That's Nabil El-Rai again, the creative director of the Freedom Theater of Jenin. I sat down with him in January to discuss the history of the theater, the status of Jenin's youth today, and to see for myself what Giuliano reestablished once the Second Intifada ended. Nabil and I spoke at length about this period of time in Jenin, about the theater's work with the youth of the city, and about his hopes for the future.
We lost a lot of people, and we lost the battle, and we lost the cause, because of a stupid gun.
On the home front in Jenin, unlike on the other side of the Green Line, the Second Intifada felt more like a war between a well-prepared army and a mostly untrained local militia. Nabil recalled the army's siege, dark days of gunfire and of steamrolling, of fighting between local forces and Israeli tanks. Here in Jenin, the Intifada, he says, was especially brutal. And to Nabil and many other Jenin residents, it felt like a fight to defend the town from invading soldiers. A much different look than what Israelis saw when shocking violence reached out to punctuate their daily lives.
Of course, every nation or every people have the right to defend themselves. Not only to defend themselves, but to fight for their rights. At the same time, if we see that the gun is not used in the right way, and it turned to be something that goes against us, I don't think it's needed. What is needed is education, cultural resistance.
After the Intifada ended in 2005, Giuliano returned to Jenin. In 2006, he reestablished the theater that his mother had once run, renaming it the Jenin Freedom Theater. Here's Giuliano at the time talking about his vision for the new theater.
You can't create a resistance with desperation. With desperation, you can create suicide bombers. And this is what we did. Now, once we learned that this is gonna create the opposite, we might start a new kind of resistance. The Freedom Theater is a place where people can think freely, where people can test their thoughts and their desires and their dreams, a place that people can be equal in sex, equal in rights, a place that people can cooperate. Look, theater is a place where you can dream, and we don't dream anymore.
The only difference I can see from the theater that once was and the theater that now exists is that there are no Israelis coming to volunteer. That's because Jenin is now located in Area A, a section of the West Bank that Israeli civilians are legally barred from entering. If you travel through the West Bank, you'll actually see giant red signs proclaiming this. Entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, it reads, is dangerous to your lives, and is against Israeli law. And Jenin, which is in the northern part of the West Bank, does feel like it's on a different planet than Tel Aviv, the city where most of the theater's volunteers used to come from. This is thanks in large part to the separation barrier that was constructed between Israel and the West Bank during the Second Intifada in order to stem the flow of suicide attacks on Israeli civilians. In this respect, the wall has been successful, but it's also done many other things, including greatly limit freedom of movement throughout the West Bank, as well as in and out of its borders.
I remember clearly, for example, one day before the Second Intifada started, everything was okay, was normal. Of course, there was a lot of depression, and there was a lot of, people are like, we don't find work, we don't find money, but at least they could, move around. 2 days, everything changed. Every area was divided. The way from my camp to Bethlehem is like 5 minutes by car. It took me 3 hours to go around and every day to go to Bethlehem.
We'll get into a more detailed discussion of the barrier later, but for now, the main detail you need to know is that it's become the physical embodiment of the growing linguistic and cultural barrier between the sides. These days, there are fewer and fewer points of contact between West Bank Palestinians and Israelis, aside, of course, from the contact that they have with the Israeli army.
Living under occupation, reality means that you're not sustainable, so you will be always under threat, and you'll never know when the threat is around. You could feel, actually. Sometimes when people come around and, you could actually cross the whole West Bank and you feel, it's okay, it's normal. But this okay is actually a very fake one, because what you can see can change in 1 second, because this can be closed. I mean, the cities can be divided in 2 minutes. And invasion can happen in 1 day, and you can build the whole scenarios, and we saw this.
Nabil talks a lot about this aspect of life in the West Bank, the surreal aspects of the Israeli presence here, the feeling that for no reason known to you, your town might be raided, you might be taken for questioning, soldiers with guns might show up and disrupt your day-to-day life. So even though life has returned to a state of normalcy since the Second Intifada, he says it takes a physical and mental toll on everyone, not just the adults.
I think it affects their way of thinking, their imagination, their dreams. They are very limited because fear is enough, more than enough, to kill your freedom. So if you're afraid, then you are not completely comfortable to think about other things. And this is my problem when somebody tells me the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I would say it's not a conflict, it's an occupation, it's a colony, and under that title we could say, okay, there is a conflict inside, but the approach is different, completely different, because when you present an occupation and say it's a conflict, then you are putting two sides as equal sides and fighting for an apple or something, and they want it back. And it's not true. What we are fighting for is for our existence. And it's really a matter of existence. Little by little, Jerusalem is being taken. Now it will continue. Now the West Bank will be taken, and I think we will disappear day after day. So this is why I'm saying it is a matter of existence. We are fight to exist.
So that's what Giuliano's theater tries to do, to create new mental spaces for the children, to allow them to dream and to create, to find unoccupied, incorruptible mental room of their own. But the work of the theater, it seems, didn't begin without criticism from some corners of Palestinian society.
Children love us. Young people love us. Up 35, they hate us. So we have big conflicts with the society around, with the PA, Palestinian Authority. We have big conflicts with the parents, with the teachers.
Nabil mentioned the same problem when I spoke with him in January. The internal pushback within Palestinian society. A reticence, one could say, to talk critically about any societal issue except the occupation and the conflict.
And there's so many different, problems. And this is really funny. It happens here many times. When we talk about Palestine and our cause, we are heroes. When we present women issue, we are traitors and we're bad people and we are out of the society. But for me as an artist, and I think as a theater, we want to address every problem. And we don't want to avoid problems and say, oh, these are great, because they are not great. I think we should be honest and open.
But despite the criticism from some more traditional members of the community, Giuliano and his fellow actors and teachers and directors continued the theater's work, putting on Arabic language plays open for all to come and see. Giuliano, who did most of the theater's promotional interviews and videos, joked once to a reporter that the work would get him killed one day.
I'm telling them about how I'm going to end my life. A bullet from a fucked up Palestinian who's going to be very angry that we are in Jenin coming to corrupt the youth of the Islam, and he's going to...
And then in 2011, the danger of the work became all too real.
Giuliano Merchamis, the head of a theater for Palestinian children, was killed on Monday in the West Bank town of Jenin. Khamis was shot 5 times by masked assailants. He had received a number of death threats from extremist Palestinians for his work with the Jenin Freedom Theater. Khamis was carrying his infant son when he was shot to death. He was just steps away from the Freedom Theater. In addition to his son, he's survived by his wife, who is pregnant with twins. We're joined now by...
Big catastrophe in our life. I think it was a huge traumatic change. I am not sure if we overcome this yet, because it's a deep trauma. But I remember clearly the people saying, if we let go, then the theater will die, and then Giuliano basically will die for nothing. If we continue, then we will say that we worked together all these years and we will take Giuliano with us and he will live.
When I visit the Freedom Theater in January, things are very much alive. The walls of the driveway that lead down to the buildings of the theater are painted with bright murals, celebrating the potential future of a Palestinian state. Off to one side, actors are practicing their lines. Kids gather and play in the driveway, running and laughing and screaming. But Nabil is a bit quieter than the rest. What does the Palestinian identity mean to you?
It means our struggle, it means our existence. It means that give me the right to be who I want to be. If I'm not given the right to be, then what is left as a choice for me? I think people are, having their freedom to say, I'm American, I'm French, and we have been covered for many, many years. I mean, I remember in the First Intifada, if you hold a Palestinian flag, you would be in prison for a year. If you say you're Palestinian, even the word Palestinian wasn't or never was presented by the Israelis before. They called us Arabs because they want to, say that we came from Arab countries, so we're supposed to go back to our own countries. We're not from here. So this is the fight for existence.
I found myself thinking a lot about this concept that Nabil mentioned. The idea that Palestinians are not from here, that they have no local history, that there are no real distinguishing factors between them and other Arabs, and that really the easiest solution to the current situation would be to have them, go back to live among their own kind. When I asked Nabil what the antidote is for these types of statements, he had a similar answer to Yvonne's from earlier.
I think what we're left with nowadays is our story.
Nabil understands the responsibility of keeping the story alive. Perhaps not through music, as Yvonne mentioned earlier, but through storytelling, through theater. for the next generation. In episode 2, we gave you a snapshot of a few interviewees who were kind enough to reflect on the meaning of their identity, both personally and in relation to the conflict. We'll be doing the same again this time around, so I'd like to introduce you to Amer Zahr. Amer is a Palestinian-American comedian. You heard a few of his jokes earlier in the show, and he's also a former lawyer as well as a writer and an activist. Amer grew up near Philadelphia in a mixed Palestinian Christian and Palestinian Muslim family, and he's an incredibly well-known figure in the Palestinian diaspora. Intractable's Ishan Hill spoke with him on the phone about his views on the role of comedy, as well as what it's like to grow up thousands of miles from the place your parents call home. Here's what he had to say.
I mean, to be a Palestinian, of course, culturally first means that, I'm an Arab, and that is my culture for centuries. But in a political sense, obviously, we call ourselves Palestinians because we come from this shared political history of refuge and dispossession and these kinds of things as a result of the actions of the State of Israel. So these kinds of experiences, which get passed on from generation to generation, is what really makes us and what really bonds us to each other. Every Palestinian, when they meet each other, they immediately ask each other, where are you from? What village are your roots from? What city is your roots from? And so that political history, in a way, is what makes our experience unique, what binds us together. I find it to be very purposeful, giving life and giving what we do a sense of purpose, that we are always, being part of a struggle for liberation is a really special thing, and in some ways it's very something that most people don't understand, and it binds us in a way that is very unique. Comedy, in many ways, is obviously therapeutic for the comedian and sometimes for the audience too. It's a way of having a narrative that is accessible by many. Right, the Palestinian story can sometimes be depressing, but if you're able to do it with humor, irony, or sarcasm, then it becomes much more accessible to other people. They hear your story, and they can connect with it. And, I've always said there's not that much difference between laughter and crying. Sometimes you might see somebody who laughs so hard that they start crying, but you might also see somebody that's crying so hard they start laughing. And these emotions are not very detached from each other. So that is our life as Palestinians, extreme emotion. And comedy is just one way to sort of tell this story.
So before we move on to the next chapter of our story, I'll leave you with one of his jokes.
So we went to the mall to go see Santa Claus, and that's when I really realized how different I was, because we stood in line for an hour, and finally it was our turn. And Tommy went and sat on Santa Claus's lap, and Santa said to him, "What do you want for Christmas, little boy?" And Tommy said, "Let me get a bike." And Santa Claus said, "Okay." And then it was my turn, and I sat on Santa Claus's lap, and that's when I realized, because I sat there, and Santa said to me, "What do you want for Christmas, little boy?" And I looked at him with my little Palestinian eyes, and I said, enforcement of UN Resolution 242, letting the Palestinians.
My name is Elham Nasruddin, and I'm from East Jerusalem.
I have been waiting so long to tell you the story of Elham. When it comes to the conflict, as we've discussed many times before, the situation here is usually painted as a black and white dichotomy. Israelis versus Palestinians, Muslims versus Jews, West Bank and Gaza versus Israel, caught in between. But as we've also acknowledged many times before, when you zoom out a bit, when you get past the headlines and the heads of state and the headaches of all the big picture stuff, oftentimes what you'll find are these sublime, paradigm-shifting people. People like Elham.
They talk to me, they think it's interesting because I'm Palestinian and Arab, coming from a Muslim background, and I don't think anybody does that here.
Does what, you may be wondering? Well, Elham is a student. That's very common for young Palestinians her age. More specifically, she's a student in Tel Aviv. That's a lot less common for young Palestinians, but certainly not unheard of. But here's the kicker. It's what she studies that sets her apart.
Jewish studies.
Elham comes from what you might call a traditional Palestinian home. Her parents, after getting married, moved to Jerusalem. Elham says it was spurred by her mother's religious practice. She wanted to be closer to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in order to pray there every day. But Elham craved a change of scenery, an independence of her own. And so, as soon as she was allowed to, she moved out of the house to begin her studies. After a brief trial period in Hebron, Elham moved to Tel Aviv, that sunny beachfront city that counterbalanced everything she knew from growing up in Jerusalem. Living in Tel Aviv, Elham began to study and started work at a local news network as an Arabic translator. She also did maybe the most Tel Aviv-y thing possible. She found a place to live with 6 other roommates.
It's also more fun because I'm the Palestinian in the house and a lot of them are Jewish, so we tend to do Israeli-Palestinian jokes. I remember once I turned on they call it the dude here, the heater. And then my roommate came in and took a shower. I was like, typical Israeli, stealing Palestinian water. And once he was inside his room talking to his girlfriend who I was waiting for, and she said, oh, Elham is waiting for me. And he said, it's okay, she's been waiting for 50 years.
But even living in Tel Aviv, a city that's often the punchline of jokes for being a semi-autonomous liberal state of its own within Israel, Elham says that being there as a hijab-wearing Muslim Palestinian was more challenging than she had bargained for. And for a variety of reasons, in April of 2015, on the eve of Israel's Independence Day celebrations, which she swears was seriously just a coincidence, Elham decided to remove her hijab.
I just realized I can do more stuff without the hijab here, because it's really harder to identify where I'm from. I look Jewish, I look a bit Arab, maybe Argentinian, I don't know, some or Latin.
Do people assume that you might be Mizrahi Jewish?
Yes, a lot of people think that, and when they hear me speak English, they think I'm from America or from Brazil. I don't know. I had Mexico, and people just try to guess, which is super funny. It's now so much easier to pass checkpoints or, make jokes about it with airport security. When they get confused, they look at my passport picture, which has me without a hijab, and my travel document which is me with a hijab, and they're like, is she a terrorist or a Mossad agent?
Interestingly enough, beyond the checkpoints and security guards, Elham says that her new hijab-free appearance saves her from one more particularly dreaded interaction.
So you have this super, super leftist Europeans who tell you how to be Palestinian and give you advice on how to live your life, or tell you have Stockholm Syndrome for Israel for not keeping BDS.
BDS refers to the boycott, divestments, and sanctions movement. We'll get back to it in a future episode. Elham says that for the most part, her friends and family back home were supportive of her decision.
When I removed it, there was some support, but then I wrote about it in the Times of Israel, and the word Israel is obviously, a red light, and so a lot of people stopped talking to me and just assumed I joined the army. I don't know, it just became this rumor that I'm joining the army, and so yeah, they were more angry about that than me removing the hijab.
Since you don't wear a hijab, you're not outwardly, obviously Palestinian or anything like that, do you notice that people's demeanors change if they hear you speaking Arabic?
Yeah, also when they hear me speak Hebrew. Because I would speak English and then switch to Hebrew, and I have such an Arabic accent in Hebrew. And I remember this guy was like, oh, you speak Arabic also? Wow, I was speaking Hebrew. You just noticed? Yep. Yeah, it does change. The other day I forgot my phone and I needed a phone, so I asked somebody in Hebrew And he said he had his phone on him, and he said, I don't have a phone. I was like, oh. So I went to another person, and I spoke in English. I was like, can I have your phone to call my phone to find it? And he said, okay. And so you see little stuff.
When I asked Elham what her thoughts were on Palestinian identity, I knew, based on her background, that I'd probably get an answer that strayed from the norm.
The conflict itself, or the idea of, like, Israel-Palestine being patriotic, is hindering the youth revolution.
But as she elaborated, I heard within Elham's answer the echoes of the answers of several other interviewees. A desire for normalcy, for the end of the conflict, for her culture and her family and her life to stop being bracketed by the constraints that the conflict puts on her.
Being Palestinian is just like being like any other person, American, French, whatever. I have a same routines. It shouldn't have such a big, huge meaning. Just, you're a normal person. I'm a Palestinian who wakes up and worries about random stuff and going to university and all those trivial but important stuff. So I think for me, being Palestinian is just being able to live my life.
Whether or not a person is able to just live his or her life in a normal way is very much determined by geography. Soon we'll return to this issue to talk more about the barrier, to talk more about Gaza, and to talk about the everyday realities of trying to make one's life as a Palestinian in a world where Palestine's status as a state still hangs in the balance. For now, I'm reminded of something the historian Rashid Khalidi said when I spoke with him back in episode 1.
Every day there are bulldozers. Every day there are concrete mixers. Every day there's land confiscated. My brother had his house that he was building in Area C just outside of Jericho destroyed by bulldozers 3 weeks ago. So, the process is not finished. And the resistance isn't finished in the sense that the people are still there, and they don't accept.
Free! Next time on Intractable, we're tackling the complex and often controversial topic of the West Bank settlements. We'll discuss the many economic, spiritual, and ideological reasons that might motivate an Israeli to live east of the Green Line. We'll pick apart what the word settlement really means and talk to Israelis who really live there. We'll also talk with one of the major players in the Palestinian nonviolent resistance movement, a man whose entire career is based on opposing settlement construction in the West Bank. And we'll meet with members of a surprising group run by Palestinians and religious Jewish settlers, a movement to get neighbors to get to know one another in this complex, confusing stretch of land. For now, I'm Skyler Inman, and this has been Intractable.
Everything relative self-development. And he said he'd been digging a plant. Give him an inch and he taking the land. Everyone's scared to be sticking.
Intractable is made possible thanks to funding from Yale University's Howland and Cohen Fellowships. We are recorded and edited at IDC Herzliya's International Radio Station, and we're produced in conjunction with the Daniel Pearl International Journalism Institute, an organization dedicated to enhancing nuance in today's reportage from the Middle East. Our business director is Ishan Hill, and music and editorial feedback come from Yvonne Saba and Rona Zahavi. Our beautiful design is thanks to the talents of Ivy Sanders-Schneider, and the life-saving work of our interns Mike Dominski and Will Reed keep the wheels of this machine in motion. For more information about our episodes, including special notes on the Palestinian musical artists we included in this episode, check us out online at intractablepodcast.com. In the meantime, follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and tell us what you think. We love hearing from you guys, and if we really like what you have to say, we might even incorporate you into a future episode. We'll see you next time.
We are free.